When the Legends Die, Chapter 11. It was the noon hour on a warm July day, and Jim Thatcher was alone in the store, both his clerks having gone home for dinner. Jim always ate early and used this slack time to check invoices. He was at his desk when he heard the yelps and the howls of a dog fight in the street. He glanced up but paid no more attention until some shouted, "Get a gun, it's a bear!" Then he jumped to his feet, picked up a 30-30 from the rack, broke open a box of cartridges, and jammed 3 of them into the magazine. He levered one into the chamber as he hurried to the door to the street. Deer and even bobcats, but few bears had wandered into Pagosa on occasion. He stepped out onto the sidewalk and couldn't believe his eyes. There in the street was a grizzly cub, hunkered back in the dust, with 3 dogs yelping and dancing around it. One dog darted in, and the bear whipped a paw, and the dog went end over end, howling in pain. Then Jim heard the boy shouting in Ute. The boy was standing at the curb, and he was as incredible as the bear cub. He was just a youngster, 10 or 11 years old, and he was dressed in the old way: moccasins, leggings, clout, no shirt, and braids. He was shouting at the cub, and the cub looked at him, starting to go to him, only to be attacked by the dogs again. It snarled, slapped another dog, and knocked it sprawling with a gash along its ribs. Men were running up from all directions. Someone shouted, "Kill it! Jim, kill that damn bear before it kills all the dogs in town." The cub, having momentarily disposed of the dogs, went to the boy and licked his hand, then faced the crowd, frightening by the uproar, growling, ready to fight. Jim said to the excited men, "Take it easy. Can't you see it's a pet cub? For God's sakes, don't start anything." He turned to the boy. "Tell your friend to behave himself, son." The boy looked at him, as bewildered as the bear cub. He said something in Ute, then caught the bear's scruff in one hand, picked up a pack that was on the street beside him, and walked away. The crowd fell back, stumbling over one another's feet. The boy and the cub went to Jim Thatcher's store and walked in, both of them. 2 men came running up the streets, rifles in their hands. "Where's the bear?" one shouted. "In Thatcher's store," someone answered. The 2 armed men started to the store, but Jim Thatcher stepped in front of them. "Keep your shirts on, both of you," he said firmly. "The bear's just a cub and a pet. I'll handle this. If anybody starts shooting, I'll finish it. Understand?" They turned and went into the store, closing the door behind him. The crowd stayed outside in the street, watching through the windows. The boy was at the counter, the cub sitting like a big, shaggy dog beside him. Jim went back to the counter, and the boy opened his pack, took out 3 baskets, and set them on the counter. Then he turned and looked around the store. Jim said, "You want to trade?" The boy looked at him, still not understanding a word he said. He went over to the knife case, glanced into it, moved to the case of fishing tackle, then to the shelves of canned goods. He paused at the bolts of cloth and the piles of overalls. Finally, he found what he was looking for: the blankets. He went down through the pile until he found a red one, exactly like the one Bessie had traded for the last time she was here. He pulled it from the pile and brought it back to the counter. The cub had been at his side everywhere he went. Now it stood beside him, watching the crowd outside the windows and lifting its 4 feet nervously. Jim asked again, "You want to trade?" And still the boy did not answer. Jim picked up one of the baskets and examined it. It was identical with the last ones Bessie had brought in, though of slightly better workmanship. He looked at the boy and asked, "Where is your mother? What are you doing here alone?" There was no answer. The boy pushed the 3 baskets towards Jim and drew the red blanket towards himself. "Your mother bought 4 baskets for a blanket the last time," Jim said, then shook his head to himself. No use talking English to this boy. He was a throwback right out of the old ways. Either that or Bessie was trying a trick so clever Jim couldn't believe it. She could be hiding in the brush. She could have sent the boy in with these 3 baskets and have told him to act dumb, but to get another blanket. It could happen, but, well, it just didn't make sense. The boy wasn't dickering. He couldn't dicker, not without at least a few words of English. Jim looked at the other baskets. All of them were of superior workmanship, the best Bessie ever made. Actually, they more than covered the price of the blanket. But if he let the boy have the blanket for 3 baskets this time, next time he would come in and try to get a blanket for 2 baskets. He asked, "Don't you know any English at all?" The blank look in the boy's eyes said truthfully that he didn't. Jim glanced toward the street and saw Blue Elk, who had just arrived. Blue Elk seemed to be asking what had happened. Somebody told him. Blue Elk approached the door, hesitated, looked in through the glass. Jim motioned to him, beckoned him in. Blue Elk opened the door and several others started to come in with him. "Just Blue Elk," Jim ordered. "The rest of you stay outside." Blue Elk came in, closed the door behind him, beaming with importance at being so singled out. Then he saw the boy and the bear cub, which looked at him and raised its hackles. Blue Elk hesitated, his hand still on the knob. He was puffing as though he had hurried. Now he caught his breath in fear and surprise. "Come on in," Jim said, "but don't come too close, and for God's sakes, don't touch the boy or the cub, or there'll be all hell to pay." Blue Elk came a few steps toward the counter. His shoes squeaked and the cub's ears stiffened. Blue Elk stopped, took off his derby hat, and wiped his forehead. "This is Bessie Blackbull's boy," Jim said. "He came in here alone. He doesn't savvy English. Find out why he came alone." Blue Elk spoke to the boy in the tongue. "We are of the people, we two. I am your friend. The man wants to know, where is your mother?" The boy said, "My mother is where I left her." He lifted his chin in pride. "Why did you come here alone?" "I came to trade the baskets for the blanket." "What does he say?" Jim asked. "He says his mother is at home. He says he came to trade for a blanket." "Why did he come alone? Why didn't Bessie come?" Blue Elk put the question. The boy shrugged and did not answer. "Why did not your mother come to trade for the blanket?" Blue Elk asked again, his voice sharp this time. The cub bristled at his tone. The boy put his hand on the cub's head, and it turned and licked his hand, then lifted its lip at Blue Elk. The boy said, "My mother." He made the cut-off sign. It could have meant that he was through with talk. He folded the blanket and put it in his pack. Blue Elk said, "I speak of your mother, not your father. I know your father is dead. Where is your mother?" The boy impatiently made the cut-off sign again. "She is dead?" The boy scowled and nodded his head. "Where do you live if she is dead?" "I live in my lodge." "Where is your lodge?" The boy shrugged off the question. "What does he say?" Jim asked. "He says his mother is dead." "Dead? I don't believe it." "My people do not lie. He says she is dead." "But she made these baskets he just brought in. They are the best baskets she ever made. When did she die, anyway?" Blue Elk turned to the boy again. "The man does not believe your mother is dead. Who do you live with?" The boy said, "I will not talk of this thing," and he made the cut-off sign sharply, incisively. "Boys do not speak to the old men of their people in this way," Blue Elk said impatiently, and he asked again, "Who do you live with?" The boy said, "I live with my brother." He shouldered his pack, then put his hand on the cub's scruff, then started toward the door. Blue Elk stepped aside to let them pass. The crowd at the doorway pushed back, making room. The boy opened the door, went out into the street, and turned toward the hills and the road to Piedratown, the cub trotting beside him. Nobody tried to stop them, but before they reached the end of the street, someone shouted, "I'm going to get that bear. Who's coming with me?" Several shouted, "I'll go." Jim Thatcher came out of the store and into the street. "Let that boy alone," he ordered, "and leave his bear alone. Understand?" Then the sheriff appeared. He wanted to know what had happened, what the crowd was doing. Jim said, "They want to go kill an Indian kid's pet bear. Put a stop to it, George, right now." The sheriff said, "I don't know what this is all about, but I'll go along with Jim Thatcher. If anybody starts a posse, the whole posse will land in jail." The crowd began to break up. Jim started to tell the sheriff what had happened, and Blue Elk went down the street puzzling over this matter. He had gone only a little way when the preacher caught up with him. "Who is that boy, Blue Elk?" he asked. Blue Elk glanced at him. "Bessie Blackbull's boy." "Bessie Blackbull? George Blackbull's woman? He was the one who killed Frank No Deer, wasn't he?" "Yes." "Then that's the boy you brought to me to have baptized." Blue Elk nodded. "What's he doing running around in a clout like a savage? He should be in school." Blue Elk glanced at him again. "Yes," he said. "Where is he living?" "Back in the mountains." "Have his parents got a permit to live off the reservation and keep him out of school?" "His parents are dead." "Who is he living with, then?" Blue Elk looked around. Several men were watching, listening. He motioned to the preacher, and they crossed the street and walked down toward the river bridge, where they could be alone. That boy, the preacher said again, should be in school. If he is left running around like this with that bear, somebody's going to get hurt. Where did you say he lives? Back in the mountains. Who with? His brother, he said. I didn't know you had a brother. Or does he mean an uncle? Blue Elk looked at him shrewdly. I could find out these things, he said. I wish you would. I baptized that boy and feel responsible for him. I worry for my people, Blue Elk said. I could find out these things, but it is a hard trip, and I am an old man. I have no money for this trip. The preacher felt in his pocket. Blue Elk heard the clink of silver dollars. The preacher drew out $1 and offered it to him. Blue Elk shook his head. This will be a very hard trip. How much? $10. I haven't got $10. All I have is the mission money. Then the preacher said, I might make it 5, and if you bring the boy into the school, the agent might give you 5 more. I am a poor old man, Blue Elk said, holding out his hand. I do this for my people. The preacher gave him the $1, produced 2 more, then drew out a handful of change and counted out $2 in dimes and quarters. Blue Elk put the money in his pocket and walked away. He went along the back streets to his house. There he made a packet of food, then went to the open shed behind the house and saddled his pony. He rode down the alleys and side streets until he was out of town, then cut through the brush to the road to Piedra. He stopped there and looked for tracks in the dust and found none. The boy had taken the paths through the brush on the hillside, but Blue Elk knew that a traveler must drink. He rode down the road toward Piedra until he came to the first creek. Then he left the road and went up the creek. His eyes were not as good as they had been 20 years before, but they still knew a boy's moccasin track and a cub bear's paw print when he saw them half a mile from the road in the creek bank mud. After that, he followed those tracks along the game trails. The boy, knowing those trails, could travel faster than Blue Elk. But Blue Elk knew that eventually the boy would lead him to his hideout.